Thank you all for joining us today for our Bayou Culture Gathering this August of 2025. And let's get started. Would like to introduce our management team. There's myself. I'm the executive director for the Wetlands Discovery Center. We also have Dr. Rachel Doherty, who's assistant director for programming and special projects over at the Center for Louisiana Studies at ULL. She's also representing the Louisiana Folklore Society. We're happy to also have Miss Maria Zarang on our team, who is a Folklife Program Director for the Division of the Arts. And of course, Dr. Gary LaFleur, who is the R.E. Miller Endowed Professor of Honors Studies at the Center for Bayou Studies over at Nicholls State. And very excited to have our staff with us, Ms. Maida Owens, who is our Senior Program Consultant, and Dr. Shauna Walton, who is our project coordinator. This is a slide that we'd like to share with all of you to say that we don't have all the answers, nor do we support a particular adaptation or management strategy to solve our problems. We're here to discuss all of those issues, and we're here to talk about why culture is important in planning. The reason why I've shared this picture with all of you today is we're in the depths of hurricane season. And so this was an image from Hurricane Ida. And why culture is because the connectivity and the social cohesion that we get from our cultural practices enable us to endure this situation that you see in that picture. The relationships that we have with people and community really are proven and shown at times of distress, like when we get hurricanes. So there are many reasons to include culture in planning, but this part of it with social cohesion and it being a tool that we can use to recover from tragedies like this is very important. So a big thank you to our funders, the National Endowment for the Arts, M.J. Sindler Family Fund for Culture and Media, the Louisiana Office of Cultural Development through the Division of the Arts, and the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities. Thanks to all of these groups for enabling us to do this work. I would now like to pass this over to Dr. Walton to talk a little bit about our outreach spotlight and what's happening with the BCC.
Hi. So one of the things that we do as part of the BCC is that we offer workshops to groups and organizations about how you can incorporate culture into planning and why that might be important for planners, not just for planners of all kinds. At all kinds of levels. And we just did one for the Mid-America Folklorist Gathering up in Fayetteville, Arkansas. We had mostly people who were either directors or programmers working for state agencies. And I cannot remember how many states were involved. In fact, Maria or Maida may remember the number of states that were involved, but they all sent representatives, and we had a fantastic discussion about ways to use particularly folk and traditional arts in building community cohesion, which helps build, what did you call it, Jonathan? Tenacity and ability to withstand disasters. If you have any questions, let us know. We'll tell you more about the workshops or what happened. Okay, that's.
Thank you very much for sharing that with us. And then we have the artist spotlight. These are a few of the Folk Life Month honorees. That's going to take place in October 2025. Maria, would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Hey, everyone. All right. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about Folk Life Month and two of the artists that we have. So each October, Louisiana Folk Life Month recognizes tradition bearers for their role in preserving and cultivating their traditional arts practice. Folk Life Month has been celebrated and supported by the Louisiana Folk Life Commission for the past 10 years. And this year we're honoring 5 tradition bearers, and today I'm going to talk about 2 of the artists. So Diane Honoré is a cultural activist and a seventh generation New Orleanian. She currently masks as Big Queen of the legendary Yellow Pocahontas Hunters, Black masking Indian tribe, where she creates beautiful suits from beads and feathers. She also founded the Black Storyville Baby Dolls to continue a masking tradition that was started in 1912 by Black women in New Orleans. In 2012, she founded another carnival group, the Amazons Benevolent Society, after she was diagnosed with cancer in an effort to give back to her community. She'll be honored for her significant contributions to her tradition in New Orleans on October 8th at 2 p.m. at Dillard University in the PSB atrium. And our second artist is Monique Matrailer, who grew up in rural Arkansas, where she began her quilting journey. It fully blossomed after she moved to Baton Rouge 33 years ago, where she continued to quilt at the LSU Rural Life Museum and where she led the junior docent program teaching crafts from the rural 1800s. Inspired by an article that she read, she founded the Round to It Quilt Group, named in honor of a woman who never completed her projects. Today, Monique primarily quilts tops made by Southern women from the past, aiming to preserve cultural history and honor their legacy. And she will be recognized for achievements in traditional arts at 2 p.m. on October 5th at the LSU Rural Life Museum in Baton Rouge. And I'll put those dates and times in the chat. All right. Thank you, Jonathan.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that with us. So this is a little bit of a breakdown of what we'll do today. On our agenda is we'll hear from Amy Kennedy. We'll have a little bit of time for questions and discussion with her. We'll ask her how she moves forward with intention, which is the theme for this year. We'll get a few working group updates and tell you how you can join with any of those groups if they're of interest to you. We'll ask all of you for any announcements that you might have. And then we hope that you'll stick around for our informal discussion that is from 1 to 1:30. So I first met Amy at the State of the Coast conference this past year and was really moved by her presentation and thought that what she is speaking about and what she is discussing would be very relevant to this group. And I think that you all are going to really appreciate the work that she does and is doing as much as I. So this is, I'd like to introduce Miss Amy Kennedy, a New Orleans-based writer and educator examining environmental issues in Louisiana. She is going to present Normalizing Ecological Grief and Anxiety. Amy, thank you so very much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Like Jonathan said, I met him right after my presentation, and I'm so thankful for this opportunity. Usually when I tell people that I write about ecological grief, they cannot get away from me fast enough because they don't want to hear about it. So it's always lovely to have an audience, and hopefully part of what I'm trying to do is to make these conversations easier and to make them happen more often. So I'm really glad you're here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to go through the slides here. Let's see. All right. So I want to take a little bit of time just to talk about kind of how I ended up here doing this research. I did not start out trying to do this research. I grew up in North Carolina and I got a bachelor's of science in English from Appalachian State University. So my background is in language. I spent 15 years teaching AP language and composition. My last classroom was at Ben Franklin in New Orleans. And so between 2006 and the 2020s, which is when I was teaching, I really started to notice a shift in my students' relationship with their imagined futures. Especially, I think it was in 2018 was when that really devastating report came out, the ICP report came out, that was just pretty horrifying. And I had a group of students who came to me right after their their AP environmental class, and they were really scared. And so they were asking me a lot of questions. Right around that time too, I also had my own children. I have a 6 and 8-year-old. So a lot of this comes from them asking me really great questions that I couldn't answer. So when I tried to start answering those questions, I was forced to grapple with my own grief about the climate crisis. And I didn't actually realize it was grief at first. But I realized I didn't have the language I needed to process the feelings or even acknowledge the feelings that I was having. So I would be spending time with my kids out, in nature, because Louisiana is so beautiful. And they would just ask me questions like, "Hey, why are all the trees dead?" In this one area that we were in, but what's going on? And so me going to find these questions, these answers to their questions, really forced me to grapple with the grief that I didn't recognize as grief at first. And once I started finding the language and working through those emotions, I found myself much more available to participate in the work that needs to be done as it comes to climate change. So it's important to normalize ecological grief and anxiety, but to do that, we have to have the right language to identify, process, and communicate these experiences. Because when we have that language, it gives us an opportunity to inject some nuance into our understanding. A lot of times it seems like people are either, "Oh my gosh, we're so doomed," or, "Hey, everything's going to be all right." And both of those mindsets are pretty harmful, because the truth is some things are lost forever and not everything is doomed. So when we have this language, it gives us the opportunity to exist in more realistic places and more realistic mindsets. So when we have the right conceptual tools to deal with climate change, or to even think about climate change, it's going to root that hope in more realistic places, and then also maybe help us deal with that fear a little bit better. So also, when you have shared language, you're able to build communities around that shared language. You're able to have these conversations. One thing I run into a lot with people in my life that aren't necessarily what I call climate people. They're not the people who can just like dive into a pretty existential conversation about climate change. What's missing is their ability to access the language that they need, I think, to talk about what they're feeling. I do want to clarify that what I don't want to do with this presentation, I'm not trying to intellectualize anyone's experiences with climate change. I'm definitely not trying to come in, especially to Louisiana and the river parishes of Louisiana, and try to tell communities how to organize or fight climate change. I'm always completely in awe of what is happening in the communities of Louisiana. The organizing that's happening in Louisiana is unreal. These communities have unfortunately had to fight so often, but they're really good at it. I think some of the best organizing and grassroots organizations are in coastal Louisiana. So I'm not at all trying to do that. I'm just trying to bring my language background into the climate conversation. So where I like to start is with what a lot of people assume is happening when it comes to people not engaging with the climate crisis. And so I want to dispel the myth of climate apathy. I do not think people are apathetic about climate change. I think there are some people who are intentionally and very carelessly destroying the climate, and they're doing it for profit. I do not think that there are people out there who are just kind of meh about climate change. We must not assume that concern is absent, but rather that it may be seeking a home. There's an environmental psychologist named Renee Lertzman who has done some clinical studies I think a lot of her work was actually in Wisconsin and Minneapolis, where she's really just saying people are really upset about what's happening to the climate. They're really upset, especially what's happening to the environment in their communities, but they don't know what to do with those feelings. They don't have a place to put them. So it's not that they don't care, it's that they care so much. And since the climate crisis is bigger than our individual choices, um, but it's caused by the collection of our individual choices, we don't know where to start or what to do a lot of times. So also what I learned teaching high school is that a lot of times apathy is not because people don't care, it's because they care so much. A lot of my students would be accused of being apathetic, and it's not that they were apathetic, they just didn't know what to do with their feelings. So apathy is kind of a self-protection, like it's what we use when we don't have an outlet for our feelings. So if we have that language, then we're maybe able to use that as an outlet. Because if we're labeling our climate inaction, our kind of inability to really dive in and find our place in this work, if we label it as apathy, then we can kind of tuck it away, right? It gives us the permission to really move on and say, well, if it's not something I care about, right? So when we have this language and maybe can say like, oh, this isn't apathy, these are feelings that I haven't dealt with, then maybe we'll be able to engage with these thoughts and these conversations. And then eventually these communities and this work. So that's hopefully whenever people talk about climate apathy, I try to shut that down pretty quickly because that ends the conversation before it can really get started. Another thing I struggled with as I was kind of acknowledging my ecological grief was discovering how different it is than, I guess, regular grief. I know grief is not linear, right? Grief is not something that has like a beginning or an end. However, climate grief is especially tricky because there is no clear end or return to normal because normal is gone. So ecological grief asks us to lose something over and over again. These are overwhelming losses, especially when we don't have the language to conceptualize it. So it's like a over and over. I mean, if you're seeing natural disasters happening over and over, you're experiencing that grief every time you interact with kind of the narrative of climate change. Also, environmental science versus the environmental humanities, that's another thing that made it really hard for me to deal with my grief, is because a lot of the environmental science that I was looking to understand climate change is communicated in a very clinical way. And that's because it has to be, that imperative of the impersonal. I put here as just a little, I guess, joke, but not really. This is that kind of Cartesian split where man, his thinking separated man from nature and really made nature a geometry problem. And so we expect scientists to be pretty clinical, but this is really hard for me to swallow, especially if I'm going to something like State of the Coast or some kind of conference in Louisiana, which there are, they're happening every day in Louisiana, which is wonderful. But you go and you're looking at these maps where you see huge portions of the state that are being kind of engineered out of existence. And you're looking at these maps and it's heartbreaking. And the person who's talking to you about them is very, very clinical. And so that was hard for me to deal with as well. And then another thing to think about with ecological grief is that hope and grief are not mutually exclusive. Climate writer Mary Anise Hegler says that we need to stop worrying about giving people hope and start letting people grieve, because climate grief is not an illness to cure. It's a condition that we have to live with, but then again, isn't all grief. So a lot of times when I talk about ecological grief, I think at the end of the presentation, people are like waiting for me to give them some kind of like hopeful nugget. And I do want to do that, but I also want people to understand that hope has to be rooted in reality. And I think a lot of times that can't happen until people have dealt with their ecological grief. So basically, once I recognized what I was feeling as grief, I started doing some research to find the language as a language person that I could use to work through these feelings and communicate about these feelings. And I got kind of frustrated because a lot of these really great ideas are ideas that are trapped in these academic spaces, and they're written in these ways that are really hard to access. And so I kind of started making it my mission to find some of these terms, and break them down and write about them, hopefully in a way that made them more accessible. So I just have two that I'm going to talk about today. But this was one of the most helpful words that I came across in my research. It's the term solastalgia, and it was coined by an Australian philosopher, Glenn Albrecht, in 2005. And it basically is a feeling of homesickness that you have while you're still at home. So it's a combination of solassalia, meaning comfort, and then also algia, meaning pain. So it's similar to nostalgia, right? Nostalgia is that desire to return to a place or a time that is in our past, but solastalgia is missing the place you're still in. Okay, and these are places that have been changed or destroyed by forces that are beyond our control, our community's control. So extreme weather, war, civil unrest, pandemic, industrial buildouts, mining, gentrification, sea level rise, wetland loss, et cetera. I mean, there's just a whole host of these that you can see on a daily basis in Louisiana. So this word, it helped me understand, okay, so that feeling that I'm experiencing, just living in Louisiana, where things are changing so quickly, like geologically, things are changing very quickly, that this has a term, right? And that doesn't fix it. I'm not trying to fix these feelings, but at least I can acknowledge that feeling, and it gives me the opportunity to communicate about it. Another term that I found to be incredibly helpful was the concept of hyperobjects. This comes from an eco-philosopher named Timothy Morton. They are a professor at Rice University. And they came up with this concept of hyperobjects, which is anything that is distributed massively in time and space relative to humans. That's the other thing about climate change, is it asks us to have to think about things on a scale and in numbers that our brains are just not ready to do that. They haven't evolved yet to do that. So hyperobjects are things that exist in a way that stretch or escape human comprehension. So climate change, cosmology, fossil fuel dependence, global warming, capitalism, deep time, the number of shows and movies available on streaming services, parts per million, the internet, microplastics. These are things that are called very large finitudes. So things that are so big that in my brain, they might as well be infinite. I think there's been a study about how if you ask people to put 1 million on a number line between 0 and a billion, a lot of people will put it smack dab in the middle, because a lot of us aren't able to think about these hyper objects really effectively. So hyperobjects makes it difficult to think and talk about something because they exist everywhere at all times. And it creates this crisis of scale, which causes, this is another term that's really helpful, number blindness, right? Like it reaches a point where I can't physically understand the scope and scale of climate change. My brain can't do it. It's that same like overwhelming feeling that I get when I think about outer space. And, there's eventually it just makes you feel kind of that like big empty feeling. And you're like, whoa, so what is that? So the word hyperobjects helps me understand like, oh, this makes me feel terrible to think about because it's beyond my comprehension to be able to do that. And so that word was really helpful. And once I understood that concept, it helped me understand, okay, so how can I push through the number blindness that is caused by a hyper object like climate change? How do I push through the anxiety that thinking about a hyper object? Because the other thing about hyper objects is I live inside of it as well. It's not something I can like get outside of to think about. So how do we push through that number blindness? How do we think about the hyper object of climate change without our fear of ecological grief and anxiety shutting down our thoughts? And one thing that I've been doing to try to help me do that is actually thinking about pointillist painting. So pointillism is a type of art where you have a big picture, but it's hundreds of thousands of tiny little dots. I think this is like 200,000 dots. This is like the most famous pointillist painting, Seurat's A Sunday Afternoon. So if I'm just thinking about climate change and I'm looking at it from far away and I'm thinking about it like, oh, this is so many different elements and aspects to it, I don't know how to start. I don't know where to begin. If I'm thinking about it like a pointillist painting, well, all I have to do, instead of backing away from it and walking away from it, if I just push in a little bit closer and I focus in on just a smaller portion of it, it becomes a little bit more accessible. If I let go of the pressure of thinking, oh, I have to understand this whole big picture all at one time, then that feels a little bit better. And then if I even push in closer to where I can see these individual dots, these individual aspects of what makes up climate change, the climate crisis, then I understand that I don't have to understand the whole picture. I don't have to even be able to see the whole picture to become a change making part of it, right? I can see myself in this picture. These are individual dots. So, learning the language to face ecological grief and anxiety can allow us the perspective we need to push in a little bit closer, to not back away, to be able to find ourselves amongst this picture and to find where we can, put our skills to work, find our place in a community that's already engaged with the climate crisis. So here are my sources. I think that was all of them. And then here is my contact information as well, if anybody wants to get in touch. And then there's also my, if you want a copy of the slideshow, that QR code should take you there. So thank you.
Thank you so much for being with us today and sharing your presentation with us.
Thanks, Amy. That was an awesome presentation. What occurs to me, and thinking about my daughters when I taught them, I feel like I taught them kind of like respect and reverence for nature. But what I didn't think about teaching them 20 years ago was like about impermanence. And like I'm thinking now, listening to what you're saying, it should just be a lesson of life that none of this is going to be here forever. And it seems like if you teach that early, then they would be less likely to be so nostalgic about things changing, right? It seems like we should expect change. I didn't think about it as a father, but now I'm thinking about that.
Yeah, and I think that's hard too, because and with my students, especially, I notice them becoming pretty nostalgic for basically a time when they didn't understand what was going on. And it was really, really hard to see, people 16, 17 years old being nostalgic, but not feeling that same sense of like hope. Because I think nostalgia without hope is like, ooh, that's not, that doesn't feel good at all. Hope is kind of the balm that it's like the back end of nostalgia that makes it, doable. So.
And another, like to build on that, I think that because we live on a delta, we should be even better at understanding that things change because it's the history of coastal Louisiana, and yet it's still so hard. Like I struggle with that a lot. And because I want it to stay, I don't want anything to change, right? I want my community to be the same one that I grew up in, that I could raise my kid in, but it's drastically different, and that's so hard to deal with. So Gary, I appreciate that comment. I don't like it, but it makes me think that that may be what I need to teach my kids, is that this isn't permanent. It's going to change, and that's okay. and I wish that that would have been um, imparted to me at a young age, because I feel like this wouldn't be as much of a struggle, maybe. So thank you for that. Robert, yes.
Yeah. Thank you for the clarity of your presentation, Amy. I was especially delighted to be able to use your talk to do some exercising of my own as you talked. And while you were talking, I was thinking about a moment in Cameron Parish when I was a child, when my mother said, "Let's go see a part of your grandfather's land." And we went to it, and it was underwater. And I remember the shock of that. And I was trying to think of how I felt about that. And I just want to point out, I'm 82, so it's probably something that's true of my age. But I found it was difficult to access the feelings in English.
Mhm.
But when I started thinking about that moment in French, the words just came flooding out. The language was there. I just thought that would be interesting to tell you since you were involved with language, but thank you again for that clarity.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that that memory too. Thank you.
Mr. Robert, was your first language French? And were all of your family spoke French?
In Cameron Parish at the time, yes, everybody used French to talk about, to tell you how they loved you or
Yeah.
didn't love you. But they used French for everything at the time.
Yeah,
That was
yeah.
when I was small. Of course,
Sure,
things
sure.
changed.
Thank you. Miss Diane, it's good to have you with us.
Thank you. It's good to be here. And thank you, Amy. I really enjoyed your presentation. And one of the things that reminded me of as I was, listening was doing work. I've done work in Southern Louisiana. I'm in Arizona, but for now almost 30 years, and was doing work in the coast and particularly looking at the impact of the oil and gas industry and the number of people involved and getting this idea that what would be great is if there were some way. So many people are connected to the Catholic Church, and we think about the tradition of confession and penance and then moving on, and it felt always like it would just be great to have like community confession, penance, and say people were involved in various ways, not just oil and gas, in other ways, in some piece of how this situation, specifically in Louisiana, climate change, of course, overlaying all of this, but came to be. And I feel like the broader climate change conversation, often people are looking like, why, how, as well. And just something that says, sometimes things don't go as we plan. Sometimes we do things that we might regret. But there are cultural practices, and it's not just the Catholic Church and penance, but that cultures have built in to allow people to move on. And it feels like that's something that the entire region, all of us globally could benefit from as well. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. There's one of the other emotions I have to work through a lot is also guilt, because and when you live in Louisiana and you're seeing these industries all the time and you're seeing what they're doing to the landscape, and you almost feel like a sense of paralysis where it's like everything I do starts to feel like an act of violence because I'm participating in these systems that are causing such destruction. So yeah, I did some research. I can't remember the name of the scholar, but it was static versus animating guilt. And so kind of working through guilt and trying to find a way to make it like a proactive experience. So yeah, it's a great point.
Shauna, did you want to share something?
Yeah, it kind of actually piggybacks on what Diane was saying. I hadn't thought of it in terms of confession and repentance. So thank you, Diane, for that. And I would love to hear more about static versus animating guilt also. But I wrote down notes while you were talking, and one that I wrote down was you'd said communities built on shared language, which of course I totally believe. And I think part of that form of shared language is something we've been talking about amongst ourselves at the BCC, which is about stories and the power of circulating stories to help communities build all kinds of abilities. And as a, sort of that special piece of language, the storytelling piece of it. And I was just wondering if, I mean, you obviously have worked with stories and things like that. So I was wondering how, I know you're working on sort of shared vocabulary, but what about circulating stories? I don't know, that sort of a question. Yeah.
Yeah. So I actually came into this work because I was trying to write a young adult climate fiction novel that would be helpful for my students or helpful for my kids. And I ended up getting so freaked out by my research that it was like my brain couldn't form a narrative. Like I was still grappling with my emotions and grappling with even trying to put, process and identify and process and write about my feelings, that I was unable to create a narrative. I was unable to kind of work through, and I'm now kind of moving towards more narrative writing. But yeah, that's a really great point, and kind of shifting. Climate change is not new, but I think I'm seeing a lot of changes in the way that we talk about it. I would absolutely love for there to be kind of cultural narratives that are normalized. That goes back to what we were talking about earlier, where then it would make it easier maybe to talk to our kids and about these kinds of things. But yeah.
Thank you for that. I guess one more question before we move on. One of the things that you had mentioned was talking about hope versus grief.
Mhm.
And I often find myself talking a lot about hope because one of the things that I came across, some quote that stuck with me, was something to the effect of, without hope, there is no action. So if you're not hopeful, why do it? If there's no hope for something to happen, then we're just going to move on to something else that we may be able to have an impact on. But I didn't think about, um I agree 100% hope has to be rooted in reality of what you said, because then we're just I mean that's just kind of silly, and not helpful. Um how do you think that, if you can expound a little bit more just on that topic of, because I don't want, I think I need to do some more exploring on this myself,
Yeah.
because I'm all about hope even when I feel hopeless. I've tried to find the places where I can feel hopeful and then latch onto them. Still in reality, but I just have to do a little bit of searching. But I never thought about the part of grief and how that needs to be a part of this process too. So can you talk just a little bit more on that?
Yeah, sure. So I think when I finally was willing to face the grief that I was feeling about climate change, it completely changed my relationship with hope. Like before I started doing this research and started doing this writing, um, my hope always felt kind of flimsy. Like it almost felt like a coping mechanism, um, versus something that was real. And now the hope that I feel is real because I'm in community and I'm doing work every day. I mean, this is what I wake up and do every day is I research and write about this. And so it's like that, having a place to put that hope, which I think a lot of people who are doing this work in Louisiana have that place to put that hope. So I think when you're trying to make people who are new to this work feel hopeful, I just try to be really careful to make sure that I'm not lying to them, and to make sure like I'm not going to just say something to them like, oh, everything is going to be okay. We just have to be hopeful. I'm going to encourage them. Hey, what are you good at? What makes you feel like, what are you passionate about? Let's see if we can find you a place in this work where you can use those skills to become active. Because I don't think like, if I'm just being hopeful about it just so I can sleep better, or if I'm just like having a hopeful thought just so I can, get rid of that angst for a minute, that's not real. And then that angst is just going to keep coming back. So that's really what I've tried to do. I'm sure that's what you're already doing, because you're doing this work all day, every day as well. But that's really what, for trying to get people into this work. How do we get you doing something? How do we get you active? Because otherwise it just doesn't feel good for long, if that makes any sense.
It does. It does. I agree with that, and I appreciate what you said on that. So moving to this next slide, one of the things that we ask our presenters is how do you move forward with intention? Because that's the theme of our year is doing things intentionally. And so if you could respond to that question, please.
Yeah, sure. One of the things that I've tried to be more intentional about is how where my attention is going. So I've tried to be more intentional about my attention. And I think for me, I spend a lot of time in online spaces. I mean, I'm in an online space right now. I spend a pretty decent amount of time with social media. And so I've tried to be really more intentional with that relationship. I'm trying to remember that when I'm engaging online, my attention is actually being monetized. I'm participating in a market. There is an algorithm that is being formed that is going to project the worldview that I already have back at me. I'm existing in a silo. I mean, it might feel like I'm existing in a community, but I'm actually kind of in an echo chamber that's been pretty, it's been made for me using a lot of technology. So I've tried to be more intentional with that. And I'm going to continue to do that, especially when I think about the fact that the companies that are making the money off of monetizing my attention are some of the companies that are doing the most ecological harm right now. So that's one of the things. Another thing, I'm trying to be intentional with my attention on online spaces. I've been trying to use sources that don't scroll forever. So this might not be like a very philosophical, like this might be like a very concrete answer. I'm trying to get my news from sources that have a beginning and an end so that I can read something and it is complete and then I can move my attention elsewhere versus a lot of these websites that we're using. Like my internet has been condensed to basically 4 websites and I run a route in my brain on my phone, and so I'm trying to diversify those sources, find sources that end so that I can walk away. Because what's happening right now with how many things I'm getting put in front of my face every day, basically my attention is going through a colander. Like I will get online and my focus gets sent in 100 different directions and I feel overwhelmed and I feel like I can't affect any change. So that's really what I've been trying to do intentionally right now is change my relationship with basically online spaces. If that, I'm not going analog. I'm not, but I'm not sitting in front of a screen trying to figure out, okay, there's 1,000 things to choose from. What do I do? So that's what I'm trying to do with my intention right now.
I really appreciate that, and I think I have a little bit to learn from your intention as well. So thank you for that. we hope that everybody sticks around for a little bit because around 1 o'clock we'll do the informal part of our gathering, and we will have Amy with us for a little bit longer that we can continue these discussions. So. Um, if you're interested in participating in any of our working groups that we have, these are the groups and their conveners. We have the French Language Preservation Group that meets on the second Tuesday at 6 p.m. with Ivy and Amy. We have the Culture and Coastal Planning that is every other Monday at 2 with Erin. Artists and Tradition Bearers, which is on a temporary break, but the convener there is Charles, and so you'll be hearing a little bit more about the work of that group coming up. Protecting Collections is the third or fourth Thursday of the month at 2, and PUD is that convener. And then Preparing Receiving Communities is the third or the fourth Tuesday of the month at 2, and that's with Madeline and Rachel. So if you have any questions about that, please send us an email or talk to us later, and we can put you in touch with the right folks. We hope that you'll join us on Friday, September 26th. For our next gathering, we will have Dr. Marla Nelson with us. She's a professor of planning and urban studies over at UNO. She will be presenting climate, culture, and migration, insights from research on relocation and receiving communities. So we're very excited to have her with us next month. If anybody has any announcements, any things that they would like to share, you can unmute, raise your hand virtually, or just jump in there. I think Gary had mentioned that the Shrimp and Petroleum Festival is coming up a little bit earlier. Yeah.
I have another thing. This
Yes.
is in the future, October 16th. That's a Thursday. The Center for Bayou Studies is helping to host an event we call the Last Acadian Coast, #2. It's a symposium about history and culture of the Bayou region. That's going to be at Nicholls, on Nicholls campus in Talbot Hall. It's going to be free and open to the public, but you need to register, and you can do that by emailing Chastity Requar, or you could email me and I can get you the contact. That's still a couple months away, so we got plenty of time to think about that.
Can
That's
you
it for
tell
me.
us,
Thanks.
but can you tell us a little bit? Is it like a poster kind of thing? Are there presenters? Are there panels? What's it gonna
It's
look
a full day of mostly talks in
like? Okay.
Talbot Hall. We're going to probably have our friends from the Traditional Boat Building Center there, and so there'll be plenty going on. And even if you're coming from out of town, the night before is an open Cajun jam in town. So you could on Wednesday see French Cajun music, and on Thursday think about it academically.
I think that's awesome. And then on Friday, join us at Rougarou Fest, and that'll take you through Saturday and Sunday. And then you have to find something fun to do on Monday, but we got that week covered. That's amazing. I'm sorry that, I mean, I'm going to be putting up tents and things like that, but I would have loved to been there because it sounds really amazing. Anyone else have any upcoming events that are taking place? Anything that you'd like to share? All right. Okay. We hope that you will stick around with us. Also, if you'd like to connect with us, you can find more information about the work that we do on our Facebook group. It's also a place for other organizations to post the work that they're doing. You can see that's an example of one of the posts there from Codafil. And so if you represent an organization that you'd also like to get your announcements to our group, please feel free to post in that group as well. So thank you so very much for being with us today. We hope that you've enjoyed this Bayou Culture gathering, and we'll see you next time.